Dear students, so in the previous chapter, chapter 12, I discussed entry modes, strategic alliances, joint ventures, so a whole bunch of entry modes that you can choose from when you enter a new market. In this chapter, chapter 13, I will give you a lot of material which is useful if you think of acquiring a company or merging with another company. Now, what is the difference between merging and acquiring? Acquiring means that a company A acquires another company B, which is by definition smaller than the other company, or it could be larger, but that is also a possibility. When it's a merger, it means that A and B are companies of equal size. Now, of all the merger and acquisitions, in fact, only 3% are mergers and 97% are acquisitions, because companies happen to be of different sizes. Now, the background reading, so the literature that you can read on which this chapter is based, is a very interesting book by Kemawat and Gadar on the logic of global mega merger. The second reference is even more interesting. That is about the purpose of merger and acquisitions must be, of course, to create value. And so how do you strategically create value from mergers and acquisitions? Of course, the Verbeke book, the book that we take for the course, International Business Strategy, is also very interesting background material. Now remember from the previous lecture, from the previous chapter in this case, chapter 12, that we have different entry modes, and we make, so this is a very important part of your papers, where you look into the choice of entry mode, and you must motivate this choice. So on the one hand, you have non-equity entry modes, you see them here. These are not foreign direct investments, so it could be that in your case you just export products to a certain market, or you think about introducing contractual agreements. Contractual agreements such as licensing, you give a license to a foreign firm to use your product, or a kind of shop formula. You have a franchising formula. Think about Benetton, for example, entering markets through franchisees, so signing contracts with franchisees. You can, of course, also be interested in having a research and development contract, so that you try to enter your market with a highly technological product, and that you need some input from your partner in the new market. And then we discussed a lot about alliances that you can look for, teaming up with a partner without investing in them. Now, last session, we also talked about joint ventures, equity joint ventures, so that you say, okay, I'm entering this market, but I do it not on my own, but I do it with a partner. So in that case, you are going to be motivated to form a joint venture. It could be a minority joint venture, a majority joint venture, or a 50-50. Now, with merger and acquisitions and greenfield investment, we are at the highest commitment, and so that means that we are here in the nice decision tree of entry mode choices, and so that we look for companies that we can acquire, that we can take over completely, and then to make out of them wholly owned subsidiaries, for example. So acquisitions are now the topic of this chapter, so chapter 13 in the Verbeke book, but I base my lecture on very many different authors. So if you think about merger and acquisition, sometimes people are very critical about this, and they say, okay, when you look over the last 30 years or so, many of the companies think that they always should, and so they are not creative enough, they don't have their own products, no, they are just interested in acquiring products or interesting services of other companies. And many of the companies, for example, Jack Welch as a CEO, he passed away last year, but as a CEO he was interested in General Electric, he was interested in acquiring companies in every strategic business unit that he was interested in. He wanted to be number one or number two, and that can only be possible by acquiring interesting companies that had already a full-fledged company, were very active and very profitable in selling products. Now, in fact, Gemowat and Gadar are saying, okay, this created companies like GE with hundreds and hundreds of strategic business units, which are mega mergers. But in fact, this is inappropriate because several of these industries that a company like General Electric was in had decreasing market share concentration. So, in fact, these mega mergers meant that companies were mega mergers, so were very, very powerful. And in fact, this has been an evolution, but we see decreasing market share concentration as a result of these companies not being profitable and being forced to sell their strategic business units in which they were not very profitable. So think, for example, of Procter & Gamble buying and selling companies, buying Gillette, then again selling it, Philips, being in the light business and then selling it again and entering another strategic business unit, for example, the medical instruments industry. Now, what is important for you as a company to consider if you're thinking about merger and acquisitions? There, I need to go to the next slide. In fact, what is interesting is that you look into what competition authorities are saying about your mergers and acquisitions. If you plan to do a merger and acquisition, you need to be aware of the fact that you cannot do a merger and acquisition whereby you have too high market shares. Now we can look into a certain index which is called the Herfindahl-Hirschman index. Herfindahl-Hirschman index is calculated as follows. So this is not a C4 or a C8, which is a concentration of the 4 or the 8 biggest companies in your industry, but it's the sum of the squared market shares of all the companies in your industry. And that gives you a nice idea about the concentration in your industry. The Herfindahl-Hirschman index ranges from one end, if you have n companies in your industry. You have 100 companies in your industry, they all have the same size, so that means that you have 100 market share. Now in that case, there is no risk when you do a merger or an acquisition that you will be confronted with a bad reputation by the competition authorities. But of course, if you are one player and you are the only player with 100% market share, then your Herfindahl-Hirschman index will be 1. So it could be for 100 players, it could be between 0.01 and 1. Now, when do you need to start worrying? When you plan a merger, think about AB InBev, a company with headquarters in Belgium, in Leuven actually, that merged with South African breweries recently. Now, they needed to worry because as a result of the merger, they could have higher market shares, higher than 0.01, because there is only a few brewers. There is Heineken, it's Art's enemy, right? There is Carlsberg. There used to be South African breweries, but also a very big player with whom AB InBev wanted to merge. And then the Herfindahl-Hirschman index might be very difficult as a result of the merger. It could be that concentration is too high. So the Herfindahl-Hirschman index is between 0 when it starts to be 0.15. There is no worries because this is an unconcentrated index. If the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, however, is between 0.15 and 0.25, that indicates a moderate concentration in your industry that you should be worried about. So then competition authorities will force you to sell off some of your companies because it's forbidden to have this high market share. Now, if you have then a Herfindahl-Hirschman index be on a higher one, more than 0.25, then it will be not possible to merge and you will have a very high concentration. So if you think about companies in the oil industry, in the car industry, in the natural resource industry, you see that there has been over the 50 years, the past, there has been a decrease in concentration instead of an increase. So in fact, the claim that all these industries are now very much monopolized and there is only a few players is not completely true. But as a kind of hint for you, if you're thinking about acquiring a company, it will be important that you don't have too high market shares and that you look into the concentration that will be a result in your industry after you merge. Now, what is the criticism on the mega mergers? Well, the first, what is in fact, what are these mergers and acquisitions blamed for? Well, first of all, the top line obsession that companies, or actually and managers, CEOs of companies, they are interested in having a higher revenue and having always more turnover, more sales in different industries, which is to please their shareholders, to please consumers. But in fact, this revenue doesn't always mean high profitability. So in fact, revenue and profits, is not the same. Second criticism on these mega mergers is that in fact people would be only interested in acquiring a company or merging with another company because of increase in the stock price, so that you have overvalued stock prices. A third criticism on mega mergers is, of course, the traditional mindset of managers, right, CEOs, that are driven by their shareholders to say, okay, I want a big telecom company in the past with the maximized number of telephone lines. I want to be the biggest. Now you see, in many countries we have indeed only 2 or 3 telecom companies operating. In the past they used to be monopolies. So in fact you see, of course, that these managers are thinking about, okay, we would like to have another company that is flourishing, and we would like to acquire it. There is also herd behavior. It's true that we are again in a situation of herd behavior, that people, when they see a merger happening in their industry, they try also to look for opportunities. And so what you see is we have waves of mergers and acquisitions because companies tend to follow each other, tend to imitate competitors. In the brewing industry, for example, at the beginning of the 90s, you had basically the opening of Eastern Europe. As a result, South African breweries, Heineken, Carlsberg, and AB InBev were chasing for acquisition opportunities to acquire one brewery after another, and that was actually herd behavior, right? And what we typically see, and that is also interesting for you to observe, is that we see waves of merger and acquisitions, and all of a sudden all these companies have too high market shares, and then we see that the merger and acquisition wave stops. What we also observe is that when the competition authorities, such as the DG Competition, the Directorate General Competition of the European Union, when they want to block certain mergers, that companies are avoiding to get into trouble, and they look into alternative entry modes, and these could be the alliances that we discussed in chapter 12. So think carefully about, if you want to acquire a company, whether it's not going to cause big troubles with the competition authorities. Then an alternative, which is chosen by many companies, is to form alliances. Look, for example, at the airline industry. The airline industry, typically you had in every European country, you had a major player like British Airways, Air France and the likes. And they didn't want to merge to a certain extent. And what you saw then as an alternative, a nice alternative, was to form an alliance. For example, we saw it between KLM and Air France before they really merged. They had already a lot of things that they did together in collaboration, and that was an alliance. Now, in some cases, and this is a fifth criticism on mega mergers, people think they should, CEOs of companies or managers, high-level managers, they think of merging because of personal commitments, because of their own personal views in favor of an M&A. And in fact, we see sometimes underperformance of the mergers and acquisitions in a certain industry, but it's just because a manager thought it would be interesting to have his children going to a school in Geneva, and they acquire a Swiss company to be able to do that. So this is, of course, not a rationale to merge or to acquire a company. And then A sixth remark that I would like to emphasize is, you know that investment bankers and consultants, such as, for example, Goldman Sachs or banks, outside partners, investment bankers, they are interested, they help you in a company like Jones Day, for example, they help you to realize the merger. But of course, if a merger or an acquisition doesn't finalize, then these people, they earn a lower fee. So in fact, these people are not completely neutral in assisting you in executing the merger and acquisitions. And these people are interested parties. And in fact, some mergers could become true because consultants want to force you to operate, to execute the merger, because in case the merger finalizes, they get higher fees than if the mergers, they get higher commissions and higher fees. And that, of course, drives mergers as well, driven by these investment bankers and consultants. Now, what are alternatives? So always think very carefully about the alternatives. Mergers and acquisitions are not the only option. It could be that you, rather than merging, you divest as a company, as a corporate company, which is which exists actually thanks to unrelated diversification. You could divest of some of the strategic business units that are not profitable anymore. And this is maybe a better strategy than artificially keeping a kind of business unit in your portfolio. Another alternative is to stay home and to improve your position locally rather than going to acquire companies abroad. A third alternative is keep your eye on the ball, so focus on exploitation of your firm's specific advantages, which we discussed, in your home country, because it's not always better to go abroad. Make friends, so I already pointed out to the possibility of forming strategic alliances rather than merger and acquisitions. And this is a very nice alternative, so look at chapter 12, study the possibility of going through an alliance. Slow, what is also a nice alternative, is prevent that your competitors are starting to do mergers and acquisitions. So then, of course, you reduce the strength of your competitors rather than going through the difficult process of the post-integration after a merger or an acquisition by your company. But try to go, for example, and that's what many companies are doing, go to the competition authorities and try to prevent the merger of an important competitor. And it's true that many of the mergers and acquisitions are actually blocked by whistleblowers, by competitors who say, oh, be careful, I'm AB InBev and Heineken is trying to take over a company in South Africa. They will, as a result of that acquisition, I feel that I, as a competitor, are neglected, right? And I will have damage will be caused to my market share, so I try to prevent the merger or the acquisition of my competitor. If your firm, your first mover advantage of a merger is not certain but dubious, then rather wait and let the others do the difficult things first and then draw your lessons out of it. It could also be that it's better to sell, that can be more justified than always trying to buy other companies. What we will do now is to look into the motivations of value. What we will do now is to look into the motivations for value creation. So when you look into mergers and acquisitions, you need to make a distinction whether your mergers and acquisitions are horizontal, vertical, or conglomerates. So conglomerates are actually combinations of horizontal and vertical mergers and acquisitions, and they have another rationale. So if you solve the question about what is the motivation for your acquisition, we will show you that you need to think about which type of acquisition am I considering. So motivations for value creation for horizontal mergers. So we start with horizontal mergers. In fact, for horizontal mergers, there are three major reasons why you would do it. First, revenue enhancement. Second, for cost savings. And third, for new growth opportunities. So if you are thinking of merging horizontally, the reason could be that you want to increase in a horizontal merger, you want to have higher revenue. Why? Because you are, for example, a company like Procter & Gamble, you are in the shampoo business and you want to go to to detergents, right? So in fact, you have increased market power when you acquire a company which already has certain market power. And you will also increase your market share if you acquire a company in that product category. Second, you could have network externalities. Network externalities in a hubs and spoke system, for example, you have network externalities. If you can link certain products or services in the telecom business, for example, you link up a landline subscription with an online subscription with the facilities to download things and to have access to the internet. So network externalities, because you can have clients that use different facilities of what you offer. A last element is that you can leverage your resources and your capabilities. So in fact, the marketing expertise that you have in the shampoo business, you can also use in another type of business, for example, in the detergent business. Second element is cost savings, and what in fact increases savings in cost. So first, for example, if you think about a company like Arcelor is a company in the steel business. Arcelor is actually used to be an acquisition of Arbet in Luxembourg with Ulcinor in France and Aceralia in Spain. So thanks to the merger you have and the acquisition of these different companies, you reach economies of scale, and you reach thanks to these economies of scale, of course, you have a reduction in the unit cost per steel output. Second, you can have scale economies. Now, scale economies, you can have them in different, don't only think that scale economies appear in production, you can also have scale economies in marketing and in research and development, for example. If you think about scope economies, well, for example, a company like GlaxoSmithKline Beecham, which I followed for my research. I studied the merger between GlaxoSmithKline and the Wellcome Foundation. Now, in fact, SmithKline Beecham on the one hand and Glaxo Wellcome on the others, and they had different pathologies and different medical instruments that they were producing. Now, there were not only scale economies, but also economies of scope because of the different medical specialties that they were active in. You have an extra reduction in unit costs. And then last but not least, you have learning economies. What is the difference between learning economies and economies of scale? Is that you have an extra reduction in unit cost. And then on the x-axis there is not quantity, but there is the added quantity, so an extra reduction in unit cost because of experience. A third and also important motivation to consider for a horizontal merger are new growth opportunities, and the reason why you acquire a company, that's actually a discontinuous change that you have in this case. So you create new business models. For example, think about a company like Barnes & Noble, which used to be a bookshop, and Amazon. They were acquired, and in fact, thanks to the fact that Amazon acquired the bricks and mortar bookshops, they entered a new business, the online book business, which in fact led to a lot of new growth opportunities in the editor and the book industry. You're also creating new resources and capabilities, and you can also be creative and find new type of products. For example, if you think about the biotechs and the pharmaceutical companies, if In many cases, big pharmaceutical companies are acquiring biotech companies which have discovered new molecules, and thanks to these new molecules and biotech procedures in the pharmaceutical industry, these big pharmaceutical companies, they can create new products and go to completely new markets and care for other pathologies and develop other processes. Now, if you look into the cost savings that were realized, for example, in horizontal mergers in the pharmaceutical industry, you see that there is a lot happening. And so this is actually based on here you see the pre-merger and the post-merger situation of a lot of pharmaceutical companies. So mergers that were realized, you see that there is a difference, there is a considerable increase in operating profit of the pharmaceutical companies thanks to the acquisition of biotechs. And why is this? Well, you see there is, of course, cost of the goods sold are decreased, research and development costs. There is also a lot of savings there because they can use the same research and development unit for both types of industries. Marketing and sales is reduced by 5% out of 30, so this is considerable. There is also savings and administrative costs, and so in fact a lot of these companies in the pharmaceutical sector increased their operating profit thanks to the acquisition of a lot of other biotech companies. And so the operating profit before was 20%, afterwards it became 40%. So that is, of course, a very strong argument in favor of acquisitions. The cost savings, which was our first main motivation for horizontal mergers. If we look now into vertical mergers are driven by other arguments. If you think of doing a vertical merger, there are two major reasons to do it. It's the first are technical efficiencies and the second are coordination efficiencies. If you think about technical efficiencies, the reason why there are technical efficiencies is, of course, because you have more control over the quality and the delivery of your inputs. If you are an oil company and you have better access to exploration, so in fact you have technical advantages. Second, you can have, for branded products that you use, you have normal products and then you have branded products. Well, in fact, if you as a company have access to the raw materials or the inputs, branded and non-branded, you can use both, and in fact you have the premium that you normally will be asked. If you have an independent supplier of your inputs, you can avoid, because now it's a part of your own firm and you can internally, you are not obliged to pay too high prices for inputs because you are completely in control. You also have, third argument, more control over the production flow. You can organize it like a just-in-time operation. You don't need to have so many stocks as in the case of an independent supplier. A third motivation is, of course, private information about the process of production of your inputs. You have complete control, so you also can limit the spillovers of private knowledge, private information on how to make the product. When it's a part of your own value chain, you have the advantage that you have complete control, and rivals don't have access to the way you produce your products. So for example, in the car industry, components, how they are made, if a Renault Peugeot factory has its own input factory, it knows how these components are made, and it doesn't depend on the private knowledge, the hidden knowledge of a supplier. The second motivation for a vertical merger is coordination efficiencies, of course. If you are the owner of the inputs in your production process, so for example in your value chain, you have raw materials, you have inbound logistics, you have manufacturing, outbound logistics, and then towards the wholesalers and the retailers, you can coordinate everything. So when there are not, for example in the textile industry, you depend a lot on the chemical industry, the BASFs and the buyers of this world. They supply your inputs, your chemical inputs. Now, these are only a few suppliers. If they are too few, they can ask you any price, and you as a textile, rugs and carpets factory, for example, you are dependent on them, but not. But if you own these pharmaceuticals, these chemical companies yourself, you will be less dependent on these inputs. So for example, for chemical fibers, for example, if you can make your own input, your own fibers yourself, you're less dependent by vertical integration. Incomplete contracts are of course also avoided, so the uncertainties are reduced. The scope of opportunistic behavior is of course also smaller, because you have a long-term relationship with your own suppliers, or even your own factory that you own. You can monitor the performance of your suppliers. So for example, for a car company, you know what the productivity is of the firms, of the plants and the factories that make your components. You can the costs of going to court and trying to argue in court to reduce a lot of inconvenience because your supplier didn't produce what you were expected, what he was expected to produce. So these contract performance costs are also minimized if you are your own boss and you coordinate everything. Disputes will not be there, and free riding, if you think also in terms of your distributors, if you own your distributors, if you can sell your own cars and you have this distribution network in the beer industry, if you own the cafes and you are responsible for them, you know what happens, and these distributors, they cannot free ride on your investments. Now, to give you a few examples, so you have, for example, a company, Medtronic. Medtronic acquired is a company that produces in the medical instruments industry from Minneapolis in the United States. They acquired a company. They were making pacemakers. And the pacemakers, the problem in the past with pacemakers was that the batteries were not of good quality and they run out of quality. So Medtronic decided to acquire its own battery company and to produce its own specialized lithium ion batteries for pacemakers, to be less dependent on independent companies, and they also were involved in the research and development process of these pacemakers. Another company, Disetronic. Disetronic was a company in the medical industry, also in anesthesiology, and they make their own. They decided to make their own pumps and their own infusion devices by producing the plastic disposable injecting pens themselves. Why? Because otherwise they were very much dependent on independent suppliers. The same happens in the bank and insurance industry. If you think about it, Allianz is a big German insurance company. Dresdner is a bank, Dresdner Bank. Now they collaborated, and in fact, bank insurance, a lot of banks are also active in the insurance industry. Why? Because there are a lot of if you, for example, start to have a life insurance, you want to buy your first house, there will be a mortgage on that house, and there will be an insurance contract that is linked to the fact that you borrow money from the bank to buy that house. So the bank activities and the insurance activities are linked, and that of course makes it possible for the bank to make a higher profit. Same thing happens with a lot of cable network companies that are also at the same time doing broadcasting. Why? Broadcasting in the future might be a completely different business. And so the business model is changing a lot. So if you are at the same time providing to the network of houses in your country, you are providing access to cable, and you can have the content of the television programs, you can combine it, and that is also a lot of produces also a lot of efficiencies, a lot of coordination efficiencies. Hospitals nowadays, they are acquiring the primary care practices of doctors, so elderly people can go to a primary care practice, and then if they have another pathology, they are sent to the reference hospital that collaborates with that primary care practice, but that of course is in the interest of the hospitals, because the hospitals can, through the primary care, they can attract a lot of new patients. So that is of course, and they can coordinate better how the stream of patients is actually sent to the hospitals. Now, I will teach you how schoolers actually think about the value creation in conglomerate mergers, and for this there are actually different views on this, and we will look into an economic view, a resource-based view, a finance view, and a managerial perspective, and then an OB, as an organizational perspective. So first, from an economic view, and we will see from an economic view the value creation in a conglomerate merger, which is actually, a conglomerate means that you have a merger vertically and horizontally. For an economic merger, the economists are quite positive about these conglomerate mergers. Why? Because in fact it functions like a internal capital market, and it is like you investing in a portfolio of different companies, and you as a single investor, you try to spread your risk, and in fact you operate like an internal capital market. The company that owns a lot of businesses that are unrelated in terms of risks, or they function like an efficient internal capital market. If you think about market power, of course, so they increase market power, but these companies like Tata and Mahindra and Mahindra, or who are really conglomerates, big conglomerate companies, they can cross-subsidize. The losses in one business can be compensated by profits in another business, and that is of course possible if you have different operations which are negatively related in terms of risk. Same, there can be mutual forbearance in the sense, and reciprocal buying, so that they can be clients of each other, and so again compensating for risk in different businesses. If you think about another view, a second view is the resource-based view of conglomerate acquisitions. So that means that in fact a lot of the resources and a lot of the idle resources in one business can be redeployed in another businesses. So the transfer of resources creates a lot of synergy effect. 1 + 1 is 3, and you have resources that can be compensated to use in another business unit. So that is of course quite important, that there are a lot of synergy effects. Finance theory is also quite positive about conglomerate mergers. Why? Because they are very cost effective, and you reduce risk, and you can as a company have more, go to the bank and have more debt capacity, because you reduce the variability in the combined income streams of the different businesses you own. You can as a company also increase your borrowing capacity, so you can reap tax subsidies on the interest that companies typically pay on borrowing, thanks to the fact that you are active in different businesses.